30 years ago, his morning started at 4 a.m. with a 2-mile walk across cracked earth just to find a bucket of muddy water. Today, one decision he makes before breakfast determines whether 100 million people have light when they wake up. There is a particular weight to a 20-liter jerrycan, not just the 8 kilograms of it pressing into the crook of your arm on the return walk. The weight of it is also the calculation you made before you left. How far today, which route, how bad the mud at the tap will be, whether the older boys will let you fill before them or make you wait until the water has turned the color of old tea. Kofi Mensah learned to carry that weight before he was 8 years old. He carried it every morning for 6 years. He has not carried it since, but he has never put it down. Today, Kofi Mensah is 41 years old, and he is the Director of Operations at the National Energy Authority, responsible for the grid that carries electricity to more than 100 million people across 4 interconnected countries. His office has floor-to-ceiling windows. There is a monitor on the wall that shows, in real time, the flow of power through every substation, every transmission line, every household junction in the network. It looks like a map of stars. Some mornings, when the early light hits the screen at a certain angle, Kofi looks at those moving data points, each one representing a life, a kitchen, a child's bedside lamp, and he thinks about the 2-mile walk. This is the story of what the walk taught him, and why it turned out to be the most important education of his life. Part 1. The Price of Survival. Kofi was born in 1983 in a rural settlement 40 kilometers from the nearest city, in a region where the rains came twice a year and the dry season arrived with a cruelty that felt personal. His father was a subsistence farmer who grew cassava and yam on 3 acres of red laterite soil. His mother taught primary school in a concrete building whose roof leaked when it rained and whose walls radiated heat like a furnace when it did not. They were not poor in the way that destroys people slowly. They were poor in the way that requires daily problem-solving, daily calculation, daily decisions about which needs to meet and which to defer. Water was the first and most urgent calculation. The settlement had no pipe. The nearest functioning hand pump was 2 miles east, along a path that crossed a dry riverbed and climbed a low ridge before descending to the concrete apron where the pump stood. In the wet season, the riverbed filled, and the path turned to thick red mud that sucked at your sandals and added 20 minutes to the walk. In the dry season, the path was easier, but the pump sometimes ran slow, reduced to a thin stream that took 4 minutes to fill a single jerrycan. On those days, you waited. On those days, you calculated. Kofi began making the walk at the age of 7, behind his older sister Alma, who was responsible for the family's water until the year she left for secondary school in the city. When she left, the walk became his. He was 8. The jerrycan was almost as tall as he was. I used to count things on the way. Acacia trees. Stones bigger than my fist. I counted to make the distance a puzzle instead of a burden. That is something nobody taught me. You just find strategies for the things that are hard. The water, when he got it, was not clean. The pump drew from a shallow aquifer that ran close to the surface, and in the years when the rains were heavy, agricultural runoff contaminated it with a tea-colored turbidity that no amount of standing would fully settle. His mother boiled what she could. What she could not boil, they drank carefully and hoped. Kofi remembers the taste, mineral and slightly flat, the specific flavor of water that has traveled through earth. What he learned in those 6 years of walks was not dramatic. It did not arrive as a revelation. It accumulated, the way sediment accumulates layer by layer, into something that eventually holds its own weight. He learned that every system has constraints and that the intelligent response to a constraint is not to curse it but to map it. He learned that efficiency is not laziness, it is the highest form of respect for limited resources. He learned that the person who understands a system's pressure points controls the system, even when they control nothing else. He learned all of this carrying muddy water across cracked earth before school. He did not know yet that he was learning it. That would take 30 more years to understand. Part 2. The Scholarship and the Current. The turning point, when it came, wore the disguise of an ordinary Tuesday. Kofi was 13, and a government examiner had come to administer a national aptitude test at the primary school where his mother taught. The examiner was a tired civil servant who arrived late, set up the test papers without ceremony, and left before the results came back. What they said clearly enough that the regional education officer wrote a personal letter to Kofi's father, was that his son had scored higher than any child in the district in 10 years. The letter offered a scholarship to a boarding secondary school in the capital. It covered fees and accommodation. It did not cover transport, uniforms, or the loss of the morning water run that Kofi's absence would create for his family. His father spent 4 days making the decision. On the 5th day, he told Kofi to pack what he had. They would manage the water. The boarding school was a revelation of infrastructure that Kofi did not yet have the language to name. There were taps that ran without pumping. There were light switches that did what they were asked. There was a generator that came on at 7 every evening and off at 10, and he could not help noticing that during the 20 minutes each evening when it coughed to life and the lights flickered in the sequence of their distance from the machine, you could read the entire electrical topology of the building from the pattern of the flicker. He started drawing the topology in his exercise books. His physics teacher, a methodical Ghanaian man named Mr. Darko who had studied in Edinburgh and come home because he believed in the coming of something, found the drawings and took Kofi aside after class. "You are drawing the grid," Mr. Darko said, looking at the diagrams. Kofi had not known that was what it was called. Mr. Darko arranged for Kofi to visit the city's main substation on a Saturday morning. The engineer on duty was a compact, efficient woman who showed him the switchgear and the transformer banks and the bus bars running overhead and explained, in the specific language of people who love complex systems, how the grid balanced supply and demand in real time. How it was, she said, the most complicated machine human beings had ever built, because it had no off switch and no margin for error, and it had to work for everyone simultaneously, all the time without exception. Kofi stood in the substation yard and looked at the humming transformers and the transmission lines stretching away toward the horizon and felt something he recognized from the water walk but had never felt anywhere else, the specific clarity of a system making itself legible to someone paying close enough attention. The grid is just water. It finds pressure. It moves through paths of least resistance. It has to reach everyone. If you understand scarcity, real scarcity, where failure has a face, you understand the grid better than anyone who grew up with reliable power. Part 3. The Long Education. The next 2 decades were a sustained argument with difficulty, and Kofi won most of the rounds. He earned an engineering degree from the National University on a merit scholarship, graduating second in his class in a year, when second meant you had not slept properly in 4 years. He spent 3 years as a junior engineer at a regional utility, mapping low-voltage distribution networks in districts that had not been properly surveyed since the colonial-era infrastructure was laid. He was methodical and fast, and he had an instinct for identifying inefficiencies, the transformer that was running hot, the feeder line that was losing 8% to resistance, the switching sequence that took 40 minutes when 12 would do, that his colleagues described as almost uncomfortable to watch. He was 29 when the first real setback arrived. He had submitted a proposal to the authority, a redesign of the Northern Grid's load balancing protocol that he had worked on for 18 months, that he believed would reduce outage frequency by 30% for 6 million customers. And it was returned with a single paragraph note explaining that the current protocol had been in place for 16 years and that institutional changes of this nature required a committee review that was not currently scheduled. Kofi kept the rejection note in his desk drawer for 2 years. He did not abandon the proposal. He spent those 2 years building, methodically and without announcement, the case that a committee review could not ignore, pilot data from 3 substations he had permission to trial the new protocol on, independently verified by an engineering firm in London, showing a 28% reduction in outage frequency. When the committee finally convened, he presented for 11 minutes. The protocol was adopted nationally within 8 months. "The walk taught me that," he would say later. "You do not always control when the pump runs or how fast it fills, but you control whether you are still standing there when it does." He was appointed deputy director at 35, director at 39, the youngest in the authority's history. At his appointment ceremony, a journalist asked him what he considered the most important qualification he brought to the role. He thought for a moment. "I understand what it costs when the lights go out," he said. "Not as a statistic. As a morning." Part 4. The grid and the walk. The control room of the National Energy Authority is a cathedral of screens. 23 monitors display every corner of the network simultaneously, generation output from 6 power plants, voltage readings from 400 substations, weather overlays from 9 meteorological zones, and the real-time demand curve that rises like a slow tide through the morning hours as 100 million people wake up and begin their days. In the center of the room, elevated slightly above the operator stations, is the director's position, a desk with 3 screens and a direct line to the system controllers of the neighboring national grids. On the morning that this story finds Kofi Mensah, it is 4:47 a.m. A tropical storm that arrived 12 hours ahead of forecast has taken down 2 transmission towers in the Northeast Corridor, cutting power to 1.4 million customers and sending a cascade fault signal through 3 adjacent substations that have automatically islanded to protect themselves. The control room is quiet in the specific way of professionals managing a crisis. No raised voices, no visible panic, just the rapid, precise communication of people who have rehearsed this scenario enough times to move through it without hesitation. Kofi arrived at 4:31. He has been standing at the central display for 16 minutes, not directing but listening, processing the information flowing in from the field crews, from the automatic switching systems, from the neighboring grids that are offering emergency power transfer. His deputy has outlined 3 restoration paths. Kofi is choosing between them with the specific patience of a man who learned, before he was 9 years old, that choosing the wrong path to the water costs you more than time. He chooses the second path. He explains in 4 sentences why. The room moves. By 6:15, power is restored to 1.1 million of the affected customers. The remaining 300,000 come back in stages through the morning as the damaged towers are bypassed. By noon, the grid is running within normal parameters. No one outside the control room will ever know exactly how close the cascade came to propagating into a full regional blackout. Kofi knows. His engineers know. They do not talk about it at the press briefing that afternoon, because the measure of excellence in grid management is that nothing appears to have happened. That evening, alone in the control room after the last briefing, Kofi looks at the monitor, the constellation of data points, each one a life, a kitchen, a child's lamp, and he does something he has done every evening for 2 years in this job. He finds, in the northeast corner of the display, the district that contains the settlement where he was born. The data point that represents it is steady. It has been steady all day. The lights are on. I am not here because I escaped the walk. I am here because the walk made me understand exactly what this job is for. Every one of those lights on the screen is somebody's morning. You do not let the morning go dark. The takeaway. Kofi Mensah still has the jerrycan. It sits in the corner of his home office in the capital, dented, faded to the pale yellow of an old photograph, the handle worn smooth by a child's hand over 6 years of early mornings. He did not keep it as a trophy. He kept it because he has never been able to explain to anyone who asks about his success what it actually felt like to learn what he learned, and the jerrycan is the closest he can come to showing them. The lesson is this. Scarcity is a curriculum. Every constraint you survive without breaking teaches you something about systems that abundance never can. The grid is a machine built on the physics of flow and the ethics of equity. It moves current from where it is generated to where it is needed, without preference, without pause, to everyone simultaneously. Kofi understood that machine before he ever saw a transformer because he had been running his own version of it since he was 8 years old on a dusty path before the sun came up. The walk made him. The grid is what he makes with it.